I'm NC Chen, and I'm a Chinese Australian artist currently based in the United States doing my master's program. Mostly work with cast glass processes, but I've recently also gone into performance. What I really like working with glass is due to its psychological qualities, which is a bit different from a lot of glass artists who use them for mostly its aesthetic qualities. So one of the things, so my background, I started glass when I was in when I was doing my undergrad at the Sydney College of the Arts and second year. I went to Beijing to study at the Central Academy of Fine Arts. As it was actually was an unintended trip. I went to China for a gap year. In the end, I think it was a very influential year for me because a lot of the theories, thoughts, and um, feelings I had during that time really informed the way I even work right now. So there was a subject matter that I really loved was about Taoism and how Taoist philosophy prevailed in Chinese art. So I kind of wrote an essay about that, about how these different theories in Taoist philosophy, kind of the idea of the five elements um, work into the different colors of Chinese scroll paintings and as well as the body. So there's this interconnectedness in the philosophy that I found really interesting. The one that is very obviously connected to Taoism is Compass Broken, which you can see behind me. Um, it is based on the Taoist compass, which is the law pattern. And the idea behind the compass broken is about the disconnect, about the cultural generation gap. So there's this phenomena that I found quite interesting, um, that I first heard about in Chinese history, like during the Turkic occupation and the Mongolian occupation, is that there's that each generation kind of lost their cultural identity. And I kind of saw that within the Australian context as well. So this work, it kind of talks about both the tectonic displacement, so you can kind of see the crack in the middle of the glass piece, and that's something I like to highlight, but also symbolically. So you have that physical element, and the symbolic element comes from the phoenix of the south, of the vermilion bird of the south, which is part of the compass broken. So in Taoist, on the Taoist compass and philosophy, is that the four cardinal directions are all guarded by a mythical beast. And the one that I wanted to draw attention to is the vermilion bird of the south, 朱雀. So the reason why he guards the south is because the equator is to the south of China, and you get the heat from there. But in Australia, that's kind of flipped around. So you have symbolically this disconnect as well, and that kind of shows in the cultural generation gap as well. Like a lot of stories are taken out of context and they lose their original meaning, and that's kind of like some of the ideas I'm exploring in this work. So the moon gates are made out of recycled glass, and they're part of a series that I was making called Kings, Dukes, Generals, Ministers. So they come from a Chinese saying that goes, Kings, Dukes, Generals, Ministers are made and not born. And I really like looking through Chinese history. And one of the stories that really all the stories that really interest me are stories of people who rise through the ranks. They're not subject to the station which they were born with. And I feel like that is very similar symbolically to what I'm doing with the material as well, is I'm taking a material that was once discarded. And basically there's tons and tons of window glass that is being thrown into tips. And that glass doesn't really break down, because the thing about glass is that they kind of last forever. And it takes a really, really like you have glass from the Roman era that's still in pretty good condition today, as they would have been in the Roman era. So that's thousands of years. And So what I wanted to do with all this glass that was being thrown away was to kind of transform it. And so I played a lot with the temperatures I was working with and experimenting with the material until I eventually got a program that would allow me to change the glass's chemical structure and make it look like jade. So jade is one of the most, I guess, coveted materials in Chinese culture. We see it as a symbol of protection, a symbol of wealth, and a symbol of nobility, basically. So I love that idea of taking something that's humble and turning it into something that's noble, like the stories of the Han Dynasty emperor, where he came from the humble background of a county jailer to eventually one of the emperors of the longest dynasties in China. So that's kind of the same, echoing that same transformation in a way. So my main process is cast glass when I'm working with glass, and it's a very lengthy process where I first sculpt everything in clay, and then I transfer it to a silicon negative, which I then pour in hot wax for a wax positive. I invest that in a plastisilica investment mold, and then that mold goes into the kiln for a minimum of 1 week with the glass inside. So, and then eventually I take it out of the kiln and start polishing it. So that's kind of like the shorthand of my process. The glass kind of molds you as a person. You become really resilient to issues because glass breaks. It's what it does, but at the same time, it's so strong. You have these like dichotomies of strength and vulnerability, of everlasting and momentary, and clarity and solidness. So those are the kind of like the elements I love playing with. And it kind of shifted my perspective on what work, the psychological element of glass, of being able to see it as when I'm working with it, it's like working with a partner. Sometimes you're surprised by the results that it has a mind of its own. So um and I've definitely it's been a bit of a mentor too, strangely. So when I go through a lot of a lot of failures, you kind of learn from each one of them and you learn to pick yourself up each time. So you even on if you watch the popular Netflix series Blown Away, you'll see a lot of the experienced glass blowers. As soon as something breaks on the floor, they don't cry over it, or maybe there's a momentary cry of agitation, and then they move straight on to the next one. And it's that same kind of feeling for most people working in glass. Is that that's there's no point crying over spilt milk. Find what the problem is, fix it. So I find that's really strengthened my character. For me, um, it comes from both an interest, a personal interest in Chinese history, and I think it comes from my parents as well, who used to tell me bedtime stories of the Three Kingdom period, for example, which I use as symbolism in the glass armor. But what I think I do differently in that is that I read the same stories, but I come from a perspective of someone who's grown up in Western culture. And in that way, I kind of subvert the stories too. When I read the stories, I learn different lessons, which I find is interesting. So there is a third culture of their own. And I like to call that intersection cultures because you're living in the border of two different cultures. And the interesting thing about living in this intersection is that you can understand perspectives from both sides. And you can even agree with perspectives from both sides or disagree with, but you understand them. And that's where the tension comes in when you're navigating this intersection. But I think it's very helpful in art as an artist to be living in this intersection because, in a way, that you can make the art kind of communes between both cultures. And like a lot of my work, for example, Birdsong kind of communes between the East and West perspective during the COVID pandemic. Or so it's kind of like a meeting place of sorts. And that for me, in my glass armor series too, is I'm looking at the mental health decline in a lot of Asian cultures. And I'm commenting on that from a Western culture, which is more forgiving in a way and more focused on awareness. So being being in this intersection, I think, is really enriching in that sense. for material. The reason why I chose the symbolism of a moon gate is that moon gates are traditionally in Chinese gardens and they frame a certain scenery when you look through them. And this idea of making everything out of recycled and reclaimed material, like the steel's reclaimed, um, the glass is recycled, is that it's the idea of kind of framing and transforming a future that you can imagine through it. So when I was making these pieces, I was thinking of maybe having a backdrop of some sort, but then I decided that they would work more powerfully as portals, and it's something for people to imagine themselves. And that's why the focus is on the doorway itself, which is out of like this kind of ethereal material of glass hash jade.